Hey guys, welcome back to Reserved Investments on YouTube. We're going in a different direction. Sorry to do this to you, but again, this channel is devoted to the entire antiques and collectibles trade and everything in between, whether we're talking about antiquities, rare art, fossils, whatever it is. So, the direction that we're going into today is specifically vintage advertising, but more specifically, Coca-Cola advertising from the pre-1960 era. Now in this video, I'm going to give you enough information to be dangerous if you want to go out and you want to start quote-unquote investing or collecting in high-end Coca-Cola memorabilia from before the 1960s. Now, before we go any further, why is it important that I keep reiterating the fact that what we're going to be talking about today is from the pre-1960 era? In the 1960s, and more specifically the 1970s or later, companies like Coca-Cola, other companies that started to realize their back catalog of advertising memorabilia was starting to become collectible, started to launch more newer advertising for their brand that saturated the market. Those particular items, mainly Coca-Cola memorabilia made in the 1980s, in the 1990s and later, has no organic collectability. And I want to reiterate that fact. With very few exceptions, Coca-Cola memorabilia from the 1980s and later is worth very little on the collecting marketplace as a whole when compared to the vintage pre-1960 stuff. The money is really in the pre-1960 items that are Coca-Cola related or even soda pop related for that matter. Now, in order to talk about vintage advertising in this context, we have to define it, and we also have to explain where the market came from, how it formed, and where it is today. A lot of you guys ask for examples of established collecting categories. Coca-Cola memorabilia from the 1960s ranks right up there with vintage comic books, with sports cards, with other established markets in the antiques and collectibles trade. Some Coca-Cola memorabilia is already over 100 years old. It already crossed over into the antique realm, and it's still going strong. Now, one thing I'm going to tell you is those critics out there that watch my videos and wonder what I mean when markets change, when they go from speculative to established to mature, Coca-Cola is a prime example. There was a time when any piece of Coca-Cola memorabilia would sell for a significant premium. Today, the market is substantially different, where collectors want to go after the rare and near mint pieces, and I will tell you what this is in a couple of minutes here. I'm just holding it up to give you an example. They want to go after the rare near mint examples, the stuff that's common, the stuff that's worn, that typically goes to entry-level collectors or enthusiasts. True investors in this genre are going after near mint pieces from before the 1960s that have a lot of collector appeal and value on the secondary market. Now, vintage advertising is a unique sector of the antiques and collectibles trade because it straddles both sectors of the trade, meaning items that are under 100 years of age or less are considered collectibles. Items that are over 100 years in age, they're considered antiques. And for those of you wondering, Coca-Cola, the company, was formed in the late 1800s. The year right now that I'm recording this video is 2020. So Coca-Cola has been around for more than 100 years. Early advertising pieces that contain Coca-Cola, the trademark, that were manufactured by the Coca-Cola company themselves, some of those pieces fetch 6 figures or more at auction, guys. I know some of you that watch my channel are really into Pokemon, into vintage video games, into Magic the Gathering, other pop culture collectibles. Well, I always encourage you guys to learn about the history of other collecting categories because it gives you insights into how these markets play out overall. Number one, you learn fundamentals, and it also broadens your horizons. For instance, if you're at a flea market and you come across a sign like this, and you flip it over, and the back has a barcode on it, that's a reproduction. you want to pass on a piece of advertising like that. This particular piece here is a 16-inch Coca-Cola button from the 1950s. This particular piece of advertising, due to the condition that it's in, it's made out of tin, by the way, guys, this is worth over $1,000. In fact, if I would put this in a high-profile auction, this would probably get near $1,500 on the market today. I paid for this particular item back right around when American Pickers came on the scene, right around 2012. I paid roughly $600 to $700 for this item. So I would have most likely, if I were to go to sell this today, I would double my money in that amount of time, in roughly 8 years. That's not a bad investment return. Now, to be fair, I'm not telling you that you're going to do that with every piece of vintage advertising you come across or you buy that is considered investment grade. And to be fair, this is an investment grade piece of Coca-Cola advertising. Ironically, this is on display in my video game room upstairs. I did film one video in that particular room. I think it was on the demise of GameStop or something about Nintendo Amiibos. So you may be able to see it in the background. It does hang on the wall in that particular room. There are also other pieces of vintage advertising hung up in that room. I just wanted to bring this piece because this video is going to center around mainly Coca-Cola. This video is designed just to whet your appetite so that you're going to want to learn more about vintage advertising, because lucky for you, I'm going to be doing more videos on this particular topic. Now, vintage advertising is very unique because this is one of those markets that have true organic collectability. You see, back in the early 1900s, even the mid-1900s, all the way up to really the 1980s, with the plethora of print advertising and television advertising, radio advertising. Well, before that time, if a company wanted to get your attention, they had to create a very premium quality, high profile advertising piece that demonstrated their name and trademark. That's why, for those of you wondering, the reason why so many people are fascinated by vintage antique advertising is because the craftsmanship and the quality that went into creating these pieces. Now, this is just one example. And if you look at it, it really isn't that much from the back side. This is literally a piece of tin that was made rather cheaply back in the day. They pretty much spray painted it the color of Coca-Cola, red, and then they put the insignia on it. Now, ironically, this is one of the pieces that is actually easy to authenticate if you find it in the wild, because most of the reproductions, as I've said, they're made in China. They usually have a barcode on them, or they're made of plastic, or they make the mistake of painting the whole piece the same color as the front. Meaning, I've seen a lot of reproductions where they spray paint the back the same red color as the front piece. These particular items were not made that elaborate back in the day in most cases. There are exceptions where there were. But overall, most Coke button signs like this do not have the back painted. That's a dead giveaway if you are trying to ascertain between a legit piece of vintage Coca-Cola memorabilia and a reproduction. Now, before we go any further, if you want to get into collecting and investing vintage Coca-Cola memorabilia, you got to get the Bible. The Bible was written by, I think the author's name, I know his last name, Alan Petretti. He wrote the proverbial Bible on Coca-Cola collecting. This book here, you can still get it on Amazon, but be prepared to pay, I think it's like $70 to $100 to get a book like this right now. This is out of print at present time, believe it or not. This is a full color guide to Coca-Cola that lists prices, it lists signs, it lists anything you want to know about the era and the years that Coca-Cola advertising was produced. A lot of people literally go after even previous editions of this particular price guide, and they collect all of them because this price guide is a work of art. And believe me, I am not corporately sponsored. I've never even met Alan Petretti, but I am giving him credit because he produced one of the greatest guidebooks on Coca-Cola and vintage advertising for that matter that I've ever come across. This was probably the best 50 bucks because I bought this new when it came out. I think this came out, this particular version, I want to say 2013, 2014. It was back when American Pickers, the television show, reignited more interest in vintage advertising collecting. And as a result, there was kind of a speculative bubble that still exists in that segment of the market that's still going strong today. Well, as a result, a lot of companies dusted off a lot of their back catalogs of books and guidebooks devoted to vintage advertising, devoted to antiques and signs, and they put them back into production. This here is the 12th edition. I highly recommend, if you do want to learn about collecting vintage Coca-Cola signs and memorabilia, you do get this edition. This is the book that I would recommend you go with. There are tons of high-profile pictures, full-color pictures, and pricing information. Now, a word about the pricing information. The pricing information in this book is completely obsolete. If you want to learn about pricing information, I usually encourage people to log on to high-profile auction sites that cater to vintage advertising. There's several companies out there that cater to vintage advertising as a whole. I'm going to save that particular topic for a video solely devoted to vintage advertising in the future. However, the two auction houses you should be aware of if you collect vintage advertising and mainly vintage Coca-Cola advertising is Rich Penn Auctions out of Iowa and Morphy Auctions out of Adamstown, Pennsylvania, of which is literally within an hour drive of my house. So this particular sign, I'm going to be 100% full disclosure, this came from Morphy Auctions. I actually went to the auction. I think this was acquired back in 2013, I want to say, right around that particular time, 2012. It was fairly early. I went to the auction myself and bid it on this in person. I was thrilled that I won it because prices even at that time were going strong. Now, let's talk a little bit about the interesting fundamentals and dynamics of the vintage Coca-Cola memorabilia marketplace. What's very interesting about vintage advertising is, and I've said this already once in this video, it has a lot of organic collectability, the early pieces. Well, I know what you're already thinking. Sean, what do you mean by that? Well, you got to understand, back when companies produced a sign like this, it was not meant to be collected. The company themselves didn't even care about the sign. They put it out there. It was meant to attract people, to put the brand in recognition and sell more Coca-Cola. That was the whole goal. It was not meant to be coveted. It was not meant to be kept in mint condition. It was not meant to become a collector's piece. Companies like Coca-Cola, Pepsi, Moxie, New Grape, all these early companies, especially in the soft drink realm, created millions of this stuff that went to general stores, that went to supermarket chains, mom and pop shops, your local, what would become a 7-Eleven. Stuff like that was created in mass. The thing is, nobody thought of saving it. It was really in the 1940s, the 1950s, even the 1960s, that people got the idea, you know, this stuff could be collectible. I really like to display this stuff in my house. So what happened was older collectors, especially in the Midwest of the country, like when you watch American Pickers, when we talk about Iowa, when we talk about really the Rust Belt states, those particular states in particular were really into that way of life. And as a result, a lot of farmers, a lot of country folk out there flocked to collecting vintage Harley-Davidson signs. John Deere memorabilia is huge. Petroliana, when you see people who collect Mobil Gas, Exxon, those particular signs, the Pegasus. And of course, soft drinks like Moxie, Pepsi, Coca-Cola, all this stuff that was readily available. You see, back in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, scrapping eventually became a thing. And there were a lot of people that would look at something like this and they would go, okay, this is a vintage Coca-Cola sign. I can either sell it at a flea market, maybe get 20 bucks for it, or even if I don't know it's worth something, I could put it out in the curb and it could be scrapped. chances are this isn't going to become a collectible. Well, honestly, what happened was people were like, who the hell is going to throw away this? Who's going to get rid of this? So people who were ahead of their time started going around and they started collecting this stuff. And demand grew as time went on, mainly in the 1970s and in the 1980s. Now, in the 1980s, something very interesting happened. America in itself was going through a transformation. And again, I'm not going to get political in this video. You guys know where I stand politically. If you don't, just let me know in the comment section below, and I'll gladly enlighten you on that. It has nothing to do with my views in the antiques and collectibles trade. But that being said, there was a transformation occurring in the United States from the 1970s to the 1980s. In the 1980s, Reagan took office, and we ended up with Reaganomics. As a result of that particular time frame, there was a trend rising in America that gave rise to materialism. Greed is good. The Gordon Geckos of Wall Street became titans. The average person out there in Main Street America was looking for opportunity, just like what was happening on Wall Street, where a lot of money was being made, and it was being centralized in the hands of the elites. Now, the elites, they love their high-end luxury goods. They like their very rare antiques. And I've already done videos on this. They like their watches, their Hermes bags, especially in the year 2020. And they tend to move in the same circles as Hollywood and other popular entertainers of the day. Well, back in the 1980s, when Reagan put forth his tax plan, a lot of people, only political thing I'm going to state in this video is I agree with this. A lot of people felt that his tax plan unfairly benefited the top 1% to 3% of society. It was known as trickle-down economics. Well, because a lot of already wealthy people were now getting even more wealth, they needed a place to spend it. And they went into antiques, luxury goods, very rare and extravagant gems, minerals, diamonds, jewelry, other antiques, collectibles, artifacts. This is when investing in antiques and collectibles went mainstream. It was really the 1980s. Well, Main Street, not having enough money to compete with Wall Street, they wanted to also get their share of the quote-unquote collectible pie. So antiques, mainly traditional antiques, and collectibles at this time started their trajectory rise in value because Main Street wanted to match what Wall Street was doing. So if you're a farmer out in Iowa and you grew up in the 1930s, you grew up in the 1940s, you may have even grown up in the 1950s. Because remember, this is the 1980s we're talking about right now, guys. You probably remember going in to a small, cafe or a soda jerk, a soda fountain, coming across, well, I remember when I was on my first date in high school back in 1957 with the jukebox playing, drinking a cup of Coca-Cola. And you probably remember some of the vintage advertising that you came across at that particular time. Well, 30 years later, what happens? You get nostalgic. You want to collect this stuff. So now you wonder, well, is there anybody out there that's collecting vintage Coca-Cola products? Because you got to remember, in the 1980s, guys, the market for antiques and collectibles was very fragmented. It wasn't like today. Today we have the internet, which really reminds me, I got to do more videos on this. The comparison between investing in antiques in the 1970s and 80s, and even before that time period, and today is almost non-comparison in a way. Because I can log on to Morphy's auctions, I can log on to Rich Penn's auctions, I can log on to Heritage at any hours of the day, and I could see real time what this stuff is selling for, or get price histories of items that sold in a previous auction, or look at items that are going to be listed in an upcoming auction. That information is power. That information binds the antique and collectible marketplace. It also binds collectors, guys. Make no mistake. That's why you have all these online collecting forums right now telling you, well, I'm going after Pokemon cards, or I'm going after Magic the Gathering, or I'm going after rare coins, or I'm going after sports cards, or, I agree with that guy, Sean from Reserved Investments, or no, I don't agree with Sean from Reserved Investments. All my critics out there. The reason why you have that is because information travels at the speed of light. We're no longer left in the dark over the value of these items. And that's what's causing a new frontier to open up in alternate asset markets and investing. And this is something that a lot of my younger individuals, my younger viewers do not understand because they weren't alive in the 1980s, in the 1990s, the pre-internet era, to see how it was, how the trade worked and operated. Now, what happened in the 1980s that caused modern era Coca-Cola memorabilia to plummet in value? Well, in the 1980s, companies like Coca-Cola, companies like Harley-Davidson, companies like John Deere, they looked at an interesting rise in the secondary market for antiques and collectibles, and they saw people come into the market going, well, I'm going to pay a premium for this 1950s Coke sign. So they scratched their heads and they said, how can we cash in on that? Well, guess what they did? They engaged in mass-produced scarcity. They said, you know what we could do? We don't need to make elaborate advertising like this anymore. We can send a lot of this stuff off to be produced in China, and we can make little plastic collectible Coca-Cola banks. We can make little polar bear stuffed toys that say Coca-Cola on them. Remember the popular polar bears that were an advertising icon of Coca-Cola, I think back in the late 1990s, early 2000s. And that's what the company did. So they started selling all this stuff as collectible memorabilia. And it ranked right up there with Beanie Babies, Pogs, modern era comic books. The companies would promote it, and collectors coming into the market who didn't want to spend the money on an authentic collectible piece of investment grade advertising would start buying up that stuff. And what do you think happened? The market cratered after 10 years of that stuff being sold and mass produced in large quantities. That's why I tell people, avoid modern era advertising when you're talking about brands like Harley-Davidson, John Deere, Coca-Cola, Pepsi, any of those hardcore brands. The stuff that's being produced today is pretty much worthless the day it is created. The same thing is true. I'm going to make a parallel here. People who collect Nintendo vintage advertising. Nintendo vintage advertising from the pre-2000 era is where the money is. I've said this before. One of the best opportunities, if you want to invest in vintage Nintendo video games, is not the video games themselves. The money is really in the pre-2000 vintage Nintendo advertising. The world of Nintendo advertising, the stuff that's coveted, the stuff that nobody saved back in the day, that's the stuff that is going to have monumental investment returns going forward, in my opinion. Because even myself, I told you guys this before, I'm not big on collecting factory sealed graded games. I think the market's too much in a speculative bubble. But I would love to get involved more in the market for authentic vintage near mint pieces of Nintendo or World of Nintendo advertising pieces. That's something I am really into, much like my love for vintage Coca-Cola pieces. So I'm going to end the video here, and I'm just going to state that if you want to get involved in Coca-Cola collecting, and you want to look at this from an investment standpoint, you are better off going after the high-grade pieces. Now, you're going to already ask, Sean, what is a high-grade piece? In my opinion, you want the piece to be in near mint condition or better with no restoration if possible. You want to buy from either a trusted dealer or an auction house. I recommend 2 auction houses right off the top. Rich Penn out of Iowa and Morphy Auctions out of Adamstown, Pennsylvania. And you also want to make sure that if you do get into this market, you must realize that you're going to have to spend a minimum of $500 to get your first piece. An investment grade piece is probably going to cost over $1,000 or more today on the market as a whole, because the one thing that we got to tie this back to is American Pickers. When American Pickers came on the scene back in 2013, or I'm sorry, it was really 2011, but they really caught on with the masses by 2013. One of the things that really shot up in value was vintage advertising. And still to this day, it is still going strong because American Pickers is still going strong. And there's a lot of collectors that are coming into this market wanting vintage Coca-Cola signs, vintage soda pop signs and advertising, even Tobacco, even oil-related memorabilia, whether we're talking, Mobil, Exxon, the Pegasus, all that stuff is trending very hot right now. There is potential for investment there, but you must understand the risks. You have to know what you're doing, and that starts with education. The first way to get educated is, if you are going to get involved in Coca-Cola memorabilia collecting, get a copy of this book. I highly recommend it. That's your first step. Your second step then is to log on to sites like Morphe Auctions, Rich Penn Auctions, and just look at previous price histories, look at previous auctions, look at upcoming auctions. Now, Rich Penn is a little bit smaller than Morphe's in size. Morphe's generally does like 3 or 4 at least vintage advertising auctions per year. What I will do for you guys is I will put the website links to both Rich Penn and Morphe Auctions in the description of this particular video. I don't think neither of those auction companies will mind, even though I'm not corporately sponsored. And full disclosure, I have no business relationship outside of buying and selling with both those firms on the down low, meaning I'm not corporately sponsored by them. So that should give you ease as to that. I'm actually recommending them because I do like the service and the products that they have at auction. And I do know that the items that you would be buying through those particular auction houses are legit. So that is always good to know. I am going to do a follow-up to this video because I think this topic is very important. It'll be interesting to see how many views this video gets, number one, and how long the length of those views are. I don't think too many people are going to watch this video to the end, but I might be surprised. Thanks for watching and have a great night. I hope you learned something from this video. If you did not, please let me know in the comment section below. Thanks, guys.